Welcome back, everybody. I'm really delighted to be hosting this session. You would have already seen me and Robert hosting or talking about this topic, this very important topic, as part of the recording. But let me introduce our two guests for you again. Mr. Robert Tickner, former Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs in the Hawke and then Keating governments. Since leaving politics, held a range of really interesting roles. Before entering politics, held a range of interesting roles, but I think relevantly as CEO of the Australian Red Cross for 10 years. And then most recently is the current chair and founding chair of the Justice Reform Initiative. And we're also really delighted to have Dr. Vicky Nagy, who's a lecturer here at the University of Tasmania in criminology, with a wide range of expertise, but particularly for the purposes of our discussion today, expertise in crime prevention, crime theory, and justice and restorative justice issues. So thanks both of you for joining us. We got some quite tricky questions, I have to say, and I should sort of make it a point of acknowledging with great gratitude the schools that have contributed all of the questions today. Unfortunately, there's a little glitch with our online form, and although we can see which schools have actually entered questions on the online form, we can't see which questions come from individual schools. So I'm sorry that we can't do a shout out and say, this is a question from Dominic College or Rosny College. The technology has failed us on that one. So please bear with us as we just sort of generalize the questions that have been put to us. So we're talking about sentencing generally, and I think we'll start with quite a provocative opening question, which is the question around, to the extent that we recognise that there is this failure in sentencing, and we'll focus on Tasmania, but we could probably extrapolate more broadly. Is that a consequence of the fact that our legislative provisions relating to sentencing don't encourage alternatives to prisons, or is it that there are alternatives there and they're just not being used by the courts when they're making sentencing decisions? Robert, do you want to tackle that one first, and then I'll hear Vicky's sort of complementary perspective, because I think the two of you bring quite different sets of perspectives to these questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the question, and good morning, everyone. It's absolutely wonderful to be with you. Can I say at the outset how inspirational it is that students are looking at these issues through the school system. I never had that privilege, and I think that what you're doing is tackling really important social issues that every single citizen should be involved in. So you're off to a flying start, and I really want to congratulate you all for your interest. I represent the Justice Reform Initiative, and our central proposition is that jailing is failing. I need to also say at the outset that we're not party politically engaged in any way. We have people in all the major political parties, from the Liberal Party, the National Party, the Greens, the Labor Party, Independents, many people who've been in public life getting behind us. Now, in answer to your question, the fundamental problem is that the Australian prison population has just grown astronomically in recent years, massively now putting us out of sync with all comparable countries in Western Europe, where we're higher than Canada. And it means that many people are being sentenced to prison who really should be getting the kind of treatment and support and programs in the community, which, number one, will divert them from the criminal justice system and address the issues that gave rise to them getting in trouble with the law in the first place. Now, this is not about being soft on crime, it's about being smart on crime. So to do this effectively, what we need are, firstly, provisions in the sentencing legislation that open up a wide range of judicial discretion with a focus on judges and magistrates adopting evidence-based policies that will make our communities safer, that will obviously address the position of victims of crime, which others will speak about this morning, but very critically will actually break that cycle that people are in that leads them in that revolving door. And the same thing in relation to people leaving from prisons. So my answer to your question very succinctly is we can make some improvements in the sentencing legislation, but the big challenge, to my mind, is to resource community-based organisations who will support people in addressing those underlying issues, whether it's mental health or disability or homelessness, that get them in that cycle of poverty and deprivation and contact with the criminal justice system. Those are not adequately resourced anywhere else, anywhere in Australia at all, and nor are the programs for people leaving prison.
Thanks, Robert. Vicky, your perspectives on that first question about is it that we don't have enough in the legislation, or is it that we're just not using what's there?
I think it's as Robert was saying as well, there's some things that we can do to help change the legislation, but there's some things that are already there as part of the legislation that we could be better using, and that better use would require more funding. So for instance, court mandated diversion for drug treatment orders is already there in the legislation. Unfortunately, it's not very well funded, which is the reason why we've got such a limited number of people who can actually go through that option. Then there's other ways.
Can I just interrupt you? Can I interrupt you just as a point of clarification? So do judges look at that and say, I know that there's not going to be enough money, so I won't even recommend it? How does that message about inadequate resourcing and the fact that there's just not places for that kind of program, how does that get to the court? How do they know that? Or is it that the courts are making those recommendations and then the administrators are saying, we haven't got a place for this person, and so they then get sentenced? How does that actually work?
So the way it works is that the drug treatment orders are administered by community corrections. So the magistrate would see the case in front of them and would actually either turn to someone from community corrections who may be in the court at that time, or would ask to have that information given to them at a later stage so that they can make a call about whether there is space and capacity to place someone into that treatment order. Because they can't just say, okay, these people can go to get the treatment order and then find out that there isn't the capacity for them. Or likewise, the capacity can't just be magicked up and created because a magistrate has asked for that to be an option. So there are certain things that kind of sit there, certain ways in which we can extend that. So for instance, alcohol treatment orders would be fabulous. Tasmania doesn't have those. Other jurisdictions around Australia do. So that means, similar to drug treatment orders, anyone who's got an alcohol issue could go down that path as well, or someone who has a drug and alcohol issue can go down that path, because currently, if you have an alcohol problem and a drug problem, you can't be put into the court mandated diversion program. So it is tweaking the legislation in some way, but at the heart of it, it's more funding that's needed.
Yeah. So there's obviously alternatives that are already there but need better resourcing. There are some things that aren't currently alternatives in Tasmania, the alcohol diversion program that you just talked about, Vicky. What are the other alternatives that will still enable politicians to say that they're being tough on crime? Robert, you talked about, we need to be smart on crime, not tough on crime, but we know that the media will easily grab hold of, if you're not tough on crime, you must be soft on it. So what are we?
That's not right. With respect, may I just say you're not right. See, the rest of the world is changing. in the United States, Republicans and Democrats are now cutting the US incarceration rate very significantly. We have to tackle this rhetoric about tough on crime. It's a nonsense.
I agree. I agree. I'm saying that there's a risk of that. And how do we get that? How do we develop the options that are palatable to a community that wants to be respectful of victims of crime and seen to be sort of tough on crime?
Well, you've raised two separate questions, and Vicky might want to get into restorative justice issues, but really I need to say that old rhetoric about tough on crime has got to be buried. I mean, there are people across the political spectrum in the United States, all through Western Europe and Canada. People realised that we were sold a furphy. We were basically Australian taxpayers paying this massive amount of money for new prisons. And in Tasmania, the figures are staggering. 2/3 of the people in prison have been there before. In terms of younger people in prison, 58% of them are back in less than a year. I mean, that's crazy. And the cost of keeping someone in prison in Tasmania? Tasmanian taxpayers are paying $122,000 every year for every prisoner, every person who's in a prison. And of course, there are some people that need to be in prison, but we're incarcerating a whole lot of people who really are there because they've been living very impoverished, marginalised lives. They've been homeless. I mean, again, I don't want to bombard people with statistics, but almost 70%, something like 67% of people in Tasmanian prisons have a history of mental illness. So my response to you is that there are programs, there are initiatives, not only in Australia, but in other parts of the world, where the incarceration rate has been cut, but more importantly, for the wider community, I guess, there's savings there. As a result of that, very significant savings that can be utilised for these other programs. But also we're turning lives around. And that's really important for our community. We don't want a marginalised underclass of people who just for their entire life get circulated through a prison system at enormous public expense. That's not good government.
Yeah. Are there places where there are really good examples of things like a mental health court that have worked to divert people from incarceration?
Yes. Yes, so definitely the case. A great example, for instance, is Portugal, where, for instance, drugs were decriminalised. And so the emphasis was placed on making drugs a public health issue. So it's no longer a criminal justice issue. It's not about punishing people who have an addiction, who may be using drugs because of mental health issues or trauma. And instead, the focus is on trying to support people. So it means that the community doesn't see it as an us versus them issue either. And I think that helps break down some of those barriers and some of those arguments made by politicians that we need to be tough on crime, because they can make that argument when people who are traumatized, who are hurting, who alongside that are offending. So it doesn't diminish their responsibility for any offences they may have done, but it is trying to understand why people may be offending and responding to it in a way that opens the community up, is accepting of people and treats it as an issue that the whole of community can work with that individual, is where you can start to see those changes in the rhetoric that's coming from politicians, that's coming from the media, the demands made by the community. And when the community sees as well that it keeps them safe, it keeps them safer in the long run, because a lot of the community's concerns isn't because they're wanting to be mean, it's because they're worried about their safety. And that's understandable. We want to be safe. We want to live in safe communities. And oftentimes people think that the answer to that is harsher punishment and imprisonment, when in fact harsher punishment and imprisonment can make things worse as Robert was saying, when you've got 60% of the Tasmanian prison population ending back up there again within 2 years, it's clearly not working, and it clearly makes the community less safe rather than more safe in the long run.
So how do those, Robert, yes.
I was just going to chip in and say, to make a point that I'm sure students will understand, given that an important part of the prison system is supposed to be, turning lives around, and we know that 2/3 of people go back into prison. Imagine if we had the same failure rate in schools, that 2/3 of the students all failed and had to go back again. I mean, we'd change our education system. It's common sense. And I really do need to emphasise that we're almost like, to use that old Australian expression, a bit of a shag on a rock, one of those isolated birds all standing alone there in the wilderness, because the rest of the world, including the country that took incarceration to an extraordinary level in the United States, people who might have watched the presidential debate between President Trump and now President Biden would have seen that they were actually blaming each other for the earlier higher rates of incarceration. So, people right across the spectrum in the United States are starting to look to alternatives that work. And we want to say to our parliamentarians here, and we have a head patron of the justice reform in Tasmania, the former governor, Kate Warner, and a lot of other patrons people can see from our website. If you just Google jailing is failing, you'll get the website and you'll see the patrons. But all of those people are essentially saying to our current crop of politicians in Tasmania, this is one area where you need to work together, where the community doesn't want party political point scoring. We want parliamentarians to try and find some common ground around evidence-based policy that will really help turn lives around, reduce that incarceration rate. And Tasmania can be a leader of Australia here because this movement is growing, but Tasmania is known for pioneering and piloting important areas of social change that in some cases have led the world. And you can do it again in this area.
The statistic that you cite about the number of prisoners who are in prison for the second, third time is absolutely mind-blowing to me. And I'm wondering, why are existing programs for prison-based rehabilitation not working? What is it that's failing in that prison system? Now, I recognise that a key issue is to simply avoid imprisonment in the first place. But if we're thinking about the fact that to some extent we will still have imprisonment as a form of punishment, what are the things that can be done to improve what we have now? And to understand that, we need to understand, why is it failing so badly to achieve those goals of rehabilitation and therapeutic outcomes?
Sorry.
You go ahead, Vicky.
Well, in Tasmania, for instance, a lot of people think that if you send someone who's got a drug and alcohol problem to prison, that they will receive treatment in prison. So that's if, for instance, they can't get the treatment order, but are actually sent to prison, that this is a great opportunity for them to get rehabilitation. And the issue in Tasmania is, even before COVID, there were only 12 places in the prison, so 12 beds in the drug and alcohol rehabilitation arm of the prison. There are 600 prisoners, and of those 600 prisoners, about 70 to 80% have a mental health issue, and about a similar number also have a substance abuse issue. So 12 beds is not nearly enough to cover everyone who would need something like that. So with COVID, they actually closed that down. So there is now currently no drug and alcohol treatment available in the Risdon Prison Complex. When it was operational as well, there were 12 beds. Those 12 beds were only for men. So the female prison population is increasing in Tasmania. It's increased by 30% in about the last 10 years. And again, the women who are there have drug and alcohol issues, but have absolutely no treatment options available to them, because it's, in some respects, the criminal justice system considers itself to be a system built by men for men. And that means that women, when they become part of this system, either as victims or as offenders, the criminal justice system kind of doesn't know what to do with them. So in this instance, it's jailing them, but they can't get access to the healthcare that they need or the treatment that they need in there. Then there's things like, other times people say, well, maybe they will get and learn a trade while they're in prison. So this will be an opportunity for them to receive education. Mm-hmm. Well, the majority of our prisoners are illiterate. So even if there are programs available, those programs, currently there are only 3 teaching staff in Risdon Prison, again, for 600 prisoners. There are different levels and very low levels of literacy amongst the prisoners. And then when trades are available, they're highly gendered trades as well. So the women, for instance, can learn how to be a beautician or a hairdresser, and that's pretty much what's available to them. And for the men, it is a case of woodwork or metal work that's available. Some of these jobs, or some of these trades, I should say, might not actually be available there for them once they're released. So they can't actually find work once they're released from prison, coupled together with the stigma that's associated with being incarcerated as well, coupled together then with people losing homes, losing access to family. Those support networks means that in prison, they've had very little support. Once they're released back into the community, they again receive very little support. Begin offending, may turn back to drugs and alcohol as well, and then revert back into the system. So it just becomes a cycle because the people aren't receiving support, even in the prison, when certain arguments made by some politicians and even some members of the public that the prison may be the place where they receive the support that they need. That support often isn't there.
Yeah, the question that was put to us was, or are these prisons just warehousing criminals? And I think what you've just said is, yes, essentially, we're not resourcing them in a way that will actually advance those rehabilitative outcomes. They really are just a warehousing arrangement at the moment. Yes, Robert.
Jan, if I just briefly supplement, Vicky's very spot on in all that she said. I think what I'd like to sort of say is that in all that I'm talking about in relation to these issues, whether it's before people end up in prison or in the prison itself, what I say is not some police or prison officer attack. I think that the responsibility for getting our police forces and our prison system to adopt world's best practice lies with police commissioners and with ministers. And, we know that, people in those roles play, important roles, but they need the absolute leadership to adopt world's best practice. So what are the alternatives? Well, there are many different approaches in other parts of the world. If people wanted to learn more, you could, for example, have a look at one very different system. That's the Norwegian system, and other Scandinavian countries are relatively similar. Apart from anything else, I think the absolute fundamental difference between us and, for example, the Scandinavian countries is the focus that the Scandinavian countries have on thinking how they want someone to leave the prison system. And essentially, I know in my state of New South Wales, there are 20,000 people leaving the prison system every year. And the figures aren't exactly clear how many leaving Tasmania, but it appears to be in excess of 1,000, somewhere short of 1,500, but a lot of people every year. And when people come out of the system in Scandinavia, the system looks to see how they will become good neighbours. you know, how their issues that they might have had when they went into prison can be addressed. And that's a fundamental starting point, as is, believe it or not, just a more general approach about building respect and self-esteem and the humanity, I guess, of people who are in prison. In Australia, imagine if you go into prison, as is just a typical snapshot, someone who might have had a mental illness, who might have been unemployed, for example, or might have had a disability, who might have had a substance abuse problem. At the moment, the evidence is, it's not just Tasmania, right around Australia, people are leaving the prison walls pretty much as they went in, except they've got a big stamp on their forehead, metaphorically speaking, you know, that is, you've been in prison, it's much harder to get a job, not easier. There are no particular programs and initiatives to try and break that cycle of unemployment. So that's essentially the answer. There are other models for running prisons that are quite different, but you know that requires our leaders in all the states and territories, with the support of the national government, to start to look at what's world's best practice. What works for all that public money in prisons? What works? And the system at the moment, you know, is, as we say, a jailing is failing system.
I think that I imagine that it will come as a surprise to some people to know that there are virtually no programs aimed at supporting prisoners post-release. I mean, obviously there's, you know, regular meetings with parole officers for prisoners that are released on parole, but what are obviously there's sort of employment support programs that could be put in place to support prisoners, but are there other programs that particularly, I imagine this is a state government responsibility mostly, are there other programs that state governments can put in place to support prisoners both to prepare them for release, but also once they're out in the community?
Absolutely. So in Tasmania, the Salvation Army operates a program called Beyond the Wire, but it's a very, very poorly resourced program. It doesn't get much funding to do its work. It really deals with a very small percentage of offenders. In New South Wales, there's an organisation that's been around for 30, 40 or more years, in fact, even longer, I think, called the Community Restorative Centre. They've got fabulous results from their work, massively reducing that recidivism rate. But they deal intensively with about 500 of the 20,000 people who are leaving the New South Wales prison system. So that's the picture Australia-wide, very, very limited resources. And as I say, we're not short of resources. Each person in prison costs about, well, in Tasmania, $122,000 a year. We're not short of resources, but we need to have the political leadership, and I'm sure we can get that if our parliamentarians work across the aisle, as some of the Americans and certainly the Europeans have been doing for years, and adopt evidence-based practice. By doing that, they'll send a message to the community that this isn't, you know, a party political war zone, and that take the community on the journey of understanding the evidence of what works and what doesn't. So imagine, you know, to give another example, the work that parliamentarians have done on both sides of the aisle around Australia on issues of disability reform. You know, they spoke with one voice. Public attitudes have dramatically changed in the last 20 and 30 years towards people with a disability. Their human rights, their humanity, their agency and aspirations have now pretty much understood by us all. That's the kind of thing that can happen when people get organised in the community and when our parliamentarians work together to educate the public in areas where, to be very frank, they've been historically, in former governments, been responsible for misinformation about prisons, suggesting that law and order is somehow virtuous, when it's really just wasting vast amounts of public money, turning people around in a revolving door.
Yes, imagine if what we could have in our allied health systems if we spent that $122,000 a year on preventative mechanisms. But Vicky, do you want to add something in relation to that that post-release support question?
Yeah, so the post-release support is massively underfunded, and outside of Beyond the Wire here in Tassie, there really isn't anything else. And what we term it as is through care. So it's caring for people from going to prison back into society, and that process should begin before someone is released. So currently, if someone is released on parole, yes, they will have regular meetings with the parole officer, a case manager, but the case managers, for instance, we don't have enough of them in Tasmania. So one case manager usually has just a handful of minutes, 5 to 10 minutes to meet with someone. And even that's not on a weekly basis, but sometimes on a fortnightly or a 3-weekly basis. So it means that the support isn't constant and isn't there for the individual. Some prisoners are, thinking that they've served their sentence and they'll be released, but talking to people like Greg Barnes, for instance, and his drive at the moment is to try and provide some what's called legal health care for prisoners, so that they know if there's any outstanding fines, because if they have any outstanding fines and they're released and the police stop them, then they can almost immediately be sent back into prison because they have an unpaid fine that they might not even know that they have. And so this sort of support needs to be in place so that we're not setting people up to fail the minute that we're opening the gates and saying, okay, you're free, off you go. And the cost of it would not be that expensive in comparison to how much we're spending on imprisonment. So Robert was saying that the figure is in Tasmania $126,000 a year. That breaks down to about $300 a day. Community corrections, so that is taking care of someone outside of the prison, whether it's home detention, whether it's a drug treatment order, that costs about $20 a day to administer. So it is a world of difference.
Yeah.
A world of difference. So much money we could save.
And so that money could then be used on a whole range of things, both for offenders, but also for the wider community that suffers from mental health or substance abuse issues and who can't access those support systems in Tasmania at the moment.
And things like counselling support. So a lot of times people think that individuals who are in prison or who have committed a crime don't know what it's like to be a victim. And that's not the case. A lot of offenders have a history of trauma and victimization from their childhood, from their young adulthood as well. And that has had an impact on the path that they're on as well, coupled together with all the other issues that may be facing them. So again, it's not to say that people shouldn't take responsibility for any harms that they've committed, any ways in which they've hurt people in their families or in their communities, but we need to be understanding of what it may be that's leading people down that path, the various primary prevention methods we could be putting into place, that is education, healthcare, employment possibilities, making TAFE and university education accessible to people, making sure that people can get access to doctors and healthcare when they need it. All of that primary prevention, if we turn the money and efforts towards that, will mean that even though it costs a lot of money and it's slow in the beginning, in the long term, in 5 to 10 years' time, we'll actually find that the number of people who need that sort of ongoing support, who are getting into the criminal justice system, who are clogging up our courts, will decrease substantially because we're dealing with the problem before it becomes a bigger issue for the rest of the community.
Yep. We've only got about 5 minutes remaining in this session. So I wanted to ask each of you a final question. I'm going to ask it slightly differently of each of you. So let me start with you, Vicky. I'll ask, what do you see as the prospects for meaningful reform on sentencing? And the coda that I'm going to add to your question is, does the fact that we have this convict history in Tasmania limit our options, or does it limit the sort of perspectives that the Tasmanian community might have?
That's a really, really good question. And it's one that I've discussed with colleagues before, is how much of what we're seeing in Tasmania and in a way across Australia is because of that convict or that colonial history and that mentality that it's brought with it. I think Australians have been, in some respects, able to tackle really difficult issues in really creative ways in other areas. So I don't think that there's a reason why we shouldn't be able to tackle this issue as well in a creative way. And that creative way could be just thinking about things like expanding the ways in which we sentence people, or for instance, deciding to, instead of build a new prison up in the north of the state, putting that money towards better developing the primary care needs of people in the north of the state. I think I'm very optimistic for change, and I think that change comes about when members of the public are educated about where their money is going to, where their taxes are going to, when they understand what the outcomes are of different ways in which we can deal with offenders. And that ends up putting pressure on politicians that they need to start thinking about this issue differently. So you can see it happen in other parts of the world where the members of the community won't be asking for tough on crime perspectives because they've seen that other measures can work, because there is a respect in a way as well for what people working in the system are doing. So Norway, for instance, where the corrections staff don't just receive 8 weeks of training, but are receiving a 2-year training course where they're paid very well for what they do. They are respected members of the community. They're not just considered to be, sort of semi-police. They're not considered to be lesser than other people working in the criminal justice system. So I think if people can see those different perspectives, they will put pressure on politicians and demand that change.
Thanks, Vicky. Robert, in our last couple of moments, we've had some questions around specifically what are the JRI's proposals for meaningful change. You've talked so beautifully about those big picture things and building that sort of groundswell support and this bipartisan support for change. What would you like to see in terms of first steps for concrete, meaningful reform in this space? And obviously you've got to be optimistic, but if you can just speak to that for a moment, that would be great.
Jan, I just don't think it's possible to get into the detail in the time we have available, but let me put it this way. The first thing is to get this train on the tracks. And to do that, we want both sides of the parliament and the minor parties and independents in all the parliaments of Australia. And we have operation, and patrons right across this country that will support this, including 2 former Governor-Generals, Sir William Dean and Dame Quentin Bryce, as the patrons in chief. But all of us essentially are saying to our parliamentarians, make a commitment to evidence-based policy, make a commitment to trying to find common ground with the other side. And let me just say this for my conclusion. The changes that have occurred in Australia since I left school and the time that I was at school at the same age as, I guess, people here are just phenomenal. I mean, there was no Sex Discrimination Act while I was the same age as the students. It was perfectly legal to discriminate against women. There was no Race Discrimination Act. It was perfectly legal to discriminate on the basis of race. people with disabilities were not accorded basic respect in the community, let alone human rights. Another area, I think, is the environment. I mean, when I was at school, there was no environment movement. There was no environment department in any of the governments around the country. We've seen these wonderful changes that have made our country and the world a better place. And we can see it in this area as well. If the community gets behind the campaign that jailing is failing, to send that message to our parliamentarians, including, my last point, right to the top, because we want to see Mr. Morrison and Mr. Albanese getting behind this as well, because the national government should be working with the states in a cross-party way to try and get a national consensus around this reform. It's a major economic question as well. So that's, Jan, if I could, that's how I'd like to end. The detail you can see from our website, Jailing is Failing, if you Google that. And my very, very best wishes to students in your future studies. And it's a great journey you're on.
Thank you so much, Robert and Vicky. Absolutely brilliant conversation. And I hope that this does inspire some of the students to, initiate a bit of a letter writing campaign. Write to all of the Tasmanian MPs. Don't underestimate the power of nagging and that sort of groundswell of community concern about where our money is being spent and whether or not this really represents a fair and effective way of spending our criminal justice funds effectively. We are going to move to a new topic now that complements this one, I think, very closely, which relates to raising the age of criminal responsibility. And some of the questions that were put to your panel, I've actually put across to the raising the age of criminal responsibility question because they really related specifically to that. But thank you so much to Vicky and Robert.
Thank you.
We'll take a couple of moments for students to stand up, stretch a little bit before we get started on the next session. But in the meantime, thank you so much to our two panelists, and thanks to students for participating in that session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.